Hi, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. This is Ryan Crodel at Valencel, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here today for what will be a very compelling webinar on hearing health in the context of healthy aging. We will get started in a few minutes. It looks like there's still quite a few people joining the webinar, so we want to give them and others a chance to get logged in before we jump in here. So thanks for your patience. We'll get started in another minute or so. Thank you. All right, very good. It looks like we've leveled off in terms of the logins here. Once again, my name is Ryan Crodel with Valencel, and we'll go ahead and get started with the webinar today. Thanks again for taking time out of your busy schedules. We're very pleased to have with us today Stefan Launer, the Senior Vice President of Science and Technology at Sonova, to walk through some really compelling research around hearing health and the comorbidities associated with hearing loss and hearing health overall. So I think you're really going to enjoy the webinar today. Before we dive in, a few quick housekeeping items. We do encourage questions and dialogue as we go along here. So please do submit your questions through the GoToWebinar control panel. And as those questions come in, we'll take those up in real time. And we also hopefully will have some time at the end for some questions, but please do, if you have questions about any of the content or anything you want us to dive deeper on, please do ask. One of the questions we always get is, will the webinar be recorded and will the slides be shared? And the answer to both of those questions is yes. Anyone who is registered for the webinar will get a link to both the slides and the recording of the webinar today. And so we encourage you to share those slides and the recording of the webinar with any of your colleagues or anyone you think might be interested who wasn't able to join us live here today. So with that, I will go ahead and hand over to Stefan. And Stefan, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. And I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you also very much for the invitation to present in your Valencel webinar on this topic of healthy hearing in the context of healthy aging. It's a pleasure for me to present and potentially discuss the various topics moving along. In this talk, basically, I want to, now why is it not moving? Sorry, just try to advance the slide and it does not move. Hello? So, It
worked just a moment ago.
It worked just a moment ago. I used the other. Let me quickly. It doesn't do anything anymore. Now, here. In this talk, I basically wanted to discuss various aspects that we have been researching and learned in the past. And it basically is around a changing picture of how we see hearing loss and its impact and relationship to healthy aging. I want to start talking about hearing loss and its impact on quality of life beyond speech intelligibility, and then discuss whether hearing instruments improve quality of life from a broader perspective. And after that, I want to dive deeply, a little bit more deeper into topics around hearing loss and other health considerations, so multimorbidities, and in particular the topic of cognitive decline, which I will briefly touch upon. And at the very end, I also will touch upon the correlation between hearing loss and other health considerations before I summarize the talk. And as we already mentioned, I'm really happy to take questions along the way. You may have to indicate them to me. I hope I notice them. Before I start diving into the various topics, I would like to briefly discuss the role of hearing in daily life. And I know many may know or may be aware about what hearing is for, but I just wanted to briefly reiterate a couple of aspects to bring them to our attention. First of all, hearing for sure is important for our ability to communicate with other people. We hear sounds, we hear speech sounds, we understand speech and language. For me, it's important to emphasize that means hearing contributes a lot to our social life and to social integration. And this is why I would call hearing also the social sense, because it helps us to socialize and to integrate with people around us. And I think that is very important to consider. It's not only about understanding speech. Speech has a very important role in our life, and that is socialization. Secondly, hearing is what I would call the unconscious sense, which I think contributes a lot to our well-being, to our feeling of security, and various aspects like that. And everybody would immediately come up with the fact that hearing monitors the environment around us, and hearing allows us to identify either a prey or a predator and warn us in a 360 degrees fashion and inform us what is going on around us. That is a very unconscious process. And we only pay attention when we think something is important. A second role of hearing, and few people think about that, is hearing also contributes to our well-being, and that's the example I am using here. So when you listen to various sounds around you, they influence how you perceive things. And as a partly funny, partly serious example, I used this example from gastrophysics, the science of food enjoyment and perception. Depending on what background music you play, this influences the wine you are going to select. Basically, when you play French background music, the probability of a person selecting a French wine for dinner is 70%. Unfortunately, the probability of a German wine is pretty much zero. Even if you play a ton of German music, you would always select German beer, but never German wine. So auditory perception influences a lot also beyond the monitoring. And also chewing sounds or other sounds influence our perception. A lot of sounds today are artificially designed to always sound the same, and that especially extends to opening of expensive bottles of champagne, the sounds of cars and whatnot, but also, for example, the sounds crisps make when you chew on them. The consistency could be the same, but the sound has been designed to make them sound crispier. And that's a super unconscious process that contributes a lot to how we perceive food. And with these examples, I just wanted to say hearing has a big role in a very unconscious way we are often not aware to, that contributes a lot to how we feel about things, that contributes a lot to our well-being and to our feeling of security, which I think is very, very important. And thirdly, Hearing is what I would call the emotional sense. When you listen to music, or also when you listen to speech sounds and the voice of a person, you immediately have affections to that. When you listen to music, music can either raise or decrease your heart rate and can influence your well-being. Music can make you feel happy or aggressive, depending on the rhythm and the beat of the music. And that is something that is very subconscious. You hardly can control it. That's a process that runs completely unconsciously and controls your emotional state. And also, when you listen to a voice of a person, it's not only the content you listen to, it's also the tone one listens to pretty intensively. And when you talk to a friend or a family on the phone, you only need few seconds of the voice to hear how a person is feeling. And that carries and conveys an awful lot of really important information, also again helping us to network and socialize with people, helps us with social orientation and a lot of other aspects. So with these points, I just wanted to reiterate that hearing in its role in daily life is extremely important for a variety of aspects related to our well-being, to our socialization, to our emotional perception, and so on and so forth. Also, hearing from my perspective is what I would call the undervalued sense. When we talk about hearing and when we do presentations like this about hearing instruments, one of the most often heard comments for me is, why don't you make hearing instruments look fashionable like glasses? They are a fashion attribute today, and that would help adoption tremendously. I think that's not true, and it's a misconception, and that is basically related to our association between poor hearing and poor seeing. If you think of a person who is wearing glasses, most often people immediately would say, "Oh, you look pretty intellectual today." And I think our association with glasses is the association with a person who can read. And the first persons who could read back in the 13th century, when the glasses were invented, were the scholars. They were the intellectual people, the intelligent people, the people working at universities, or the monks. So one had a very strong, very positive association with wearing glasses. While when you look at hearing loss and hearing impaired people were always put in the category of the deaf and the dumb until maybe only 100 years ago. The association and the stigma related to hearing loss was always completely different. So the comparison between glasses and or poor seeing, poor vision, and poor hearing is completely, from my point of view, misleading. From one point, glasses are intellectual, while hearing impairment has a different association more towards being mentally retarded. And I think that is very important for me to consider and keep in mind when thinking about hearing loss and its impact on life. I think we have to take a little bit a broader perspective and not the narrow perspective we have had in the past years, where it was all related to hearing, but we never really tried to understand what does hearing really mean for our quality of life. And now I want to briefly discuss what do we know today about how hearing loss impacts quality of life beyond speech intelligibility. I think everybody can easily understand that hearing loss impacts our ability to identify sounds, to hear sounds, to distinguish sounds, and also to understand speech sounds and hear speech sounds. That for sure are big problems, and we have to take them into consideration. However, I think hearing loss has other effects too, which are much less known, and which I want to discuss now briefly. One effect, for example, is that when people suffer of hearing loss, they may not often notice that it's not only their ability to understand speech that is limited, but that sometimes they can compensate poor speech understanding by paying higher attention and exerting much higher effort. And with that, compensating for poor speech understanding with higher effort and being fatigued in a much faster way. We did PhD thesis with Barbara Timmer in University of Queensland in Brisbane and Louise Hickson, where we provided people with smartphones and a tool called ecologic momentary assessment, where in a daily life environment, people could record several times per day the listening environment they were in, the communication the listening task they participated in, and how they felt about it. And when we analyzed the data after 2 weeks using of these devices and filling in questionnaires with 30 subjects, what we could realize is that these were all people with a mild hearing loss, so not a very severe hearing loss. And they were all borderline deciding whether they wanted a device or not. And when we looked at the answers afterwards of the questionnaires, we could realize that most people, 80%, would answer the question about their ability to communicate in different listening conditions. They would always answer that they were well able to follow a conversation and to participate in a conversation. So speech intelligibility didn't seem to be their problem. However, when we looked at the effort they had to exert, we realized that most of the people said, I can understand speech, but typically they said that they would be pretty fatigued and tired, and they would have to put in a lot of effort to follow a conversation. However, they never put one and one together, and they always thought, I do understand speech, hence I don't have a hearing problem, and that I'm tired at the end of the day is because I'm older. So they did not associate the two things with each other. So basically, from my perspective, when we talk about hearing loss, especially and the consequences of hearing loss, when we talk about it today to people with a mild hearing loss, we don't have to talk about speech intelligibility. We have to talk about how effortful it is and that they have to pay attention to that dimension rather than intelligibility alone. So that shifted our perspective and on the consequences of hearing loss quite significantly. Also, we looked at the ability of people with hearing loss to identify emotional aspects of speech signals. So we basically did two things. We had a web-based questionnaire where we asked more than 500 people several questions in a designed questionnaire. My colleague Gurjit Singh did that, where we asked people about their ability to identify affective speech sounds and the different dimensions in it. And we had several sets of questions, and what we could see, grosso modo, and you see that in the left picture, we could see that hearing impaired people had much poorer ability or much more handicap with emotion perception. So the ability to identify whether something was spoken with a happy, a sad, an angry or an excited voice. People also reported that they had much more problems with identifying that and also with controlling their own affection, which was also a problem. And they also answered that this would be problematic for them in daily life environments. So from this web-based questionnaire, we knew that people would have problems in identifying affective aspects of sounds. And then we went to the lab and wanted to test that more precisely, and we designed lab studies, and various groups have repeated this in the meantime, where we presented people with emotional sounds and emotional speech sounds and asked them to identify the emotion that was expressed. And again, we could see that hearing impaired people had much more problems and limitations with identifying the right emotion. You see that in the right picture. The pink and the red columns bars represent the results of the hearing impaired people. The gray bars result the percent correct scores for the normal hearing people. And you can also see in this graph that unfortunately our hearing instruments don't do yet a good job in restoring this emotion perception content. So here is some work for us to do to improve our hearing instruments. And when you think about what that means, that you can't detect whether somebody speaks in a sad or angry voice or in a happy voice to you, this poses severe limitations on your abilities to respond in a social setting in an appropriate way. And this can certainly cause conflicts, and it can also cause a person to be stressed and anxious of social participation. So this is an important aspect to consider. Frank Lin and his team in Baltimore took this concept a little bit further, and they coined the term emotional vitality, where they looked at a meta score of how well person felt that they could master their life independently, how happy they felt, how many signs of depression they showed, and how much anxiety they showed. They developed a questionnaire to assess emotional vitality, and they studied 3,000 plus subjects in a larger study. And they could clearly show that hearing loss increases the odds of a poorer emotional vitality, as described as this composite measure. So again, we can see that hearing loss impacts quality of life on multiple dimensions in a much broader sense than just being able to follow a speech sound. So overall today, we have pretty strong and evidence showing that hearing loss certainly impacts our ability to hear and to communicate easily. But on top of that, hearing loss also causes people to experience much more fatigue when they participate in social settings. It impacts the emotional vitality of a person. It impacts the emotional functioning of a person. And that can lead to a much stronger social isolation and loneliness and distress. And we have to also consider here that this in turn might also impact their ability to work. Hearing impaired people often show a lower educational level, lower salary, much higher probability of being unemployed for a longer time. So it has, again, a broader impact on quality of life. And also, hearing loss not only impacts the persons themselves, but also impacts third parties, spouses, and families, in that also the activities of these people are limited and restricted. So it has a pretty broad impact on a person and their families. There has been a lot of discussion around hearing loss and its impact on depression. A number of studies have clearly shown that hearing loss might impact and might cause and lead to depression. Others have shown a weaker correlation. I think this study here by Marieke Pronk and Sophia Kramer has detailed the potential mechanisms, and has especially discussed that it very much depends on all the confounding factors and what you consider and what not. In their study, they could show a correlation between hearing loss and loneliness. but that it depended on the amount of hearing loss. The more hearing loss you have, the more lonely you feel, was one of the major conclusions for them. So hearing loss and loneliness, you find a correlation, but mostly for specific subgroups. So overall, I think hearing loss impacts quality of life on a much broader level than just limiting our ability to hear sounds. It impacts the emotional functioning, it causes distress and fatigue, it causes social isolation, and impacts us on a pretty broad level. So that's something to consider when developing and talking about hearing instruments in the future. Now, do we already have any evidence to show that hearing instruments potentially improve quality of life beyond the classical measures of speech intelligibility? And yes, we have various forms of preliminary evidence. I think we can do far more, but we have some evidence that already shows that there is improvement. In this study, Matthias Latzel and Markus Mais had a setting where people were sitting around a table in a dinner table-like conversation in a background noise that was played, resembling a cafeteria noise. They had all hearing instruments, and their task was to talk to each other, to have a conversation, while independent observers were switching the directional microphones and the noise cancelling performance of their hearing instruments. And then the observers noted how the people would behave. And what you could clearly see is that when we switched on the more sophisticated algorithms to reduce the impact of background noise, we could clearly see that people started to engage more in the conversations, to be socially more active, to have less head turns and things like that. So we can see that sophisticated technologies can simplify interaction and social participation in complex cocktail party situations. So we see a behavioral change on top of the ability to follow a speech sound. Ben Hornsby from Vanderbilt has done a very interesting study where they tested the fatigue of a person in a listening condition. They tested the perception of speech sounds in a cafeteria background babble presented from 5 loudspeakers, and people had to store the last 5 words in memory for recall. And they measured basically 2 things. One thing was the response rate, so the correctly identified words, as well as the reaction time people had. And when you look at the results here, you could clearly see that people with unaided hearing had a significant increase in their reaction time over time, which is a sign of them becoming fatigued. Whereas when you repeat the same trial with a hearing instrument, you can clearly see that the reaction time is lower, so they react faster, plus the decline over time is shallower, indicating that with a hearing instrument in a fatiguing task, people fatigue less. So again, beyond the pure understanding of speech and the speech intelligibility scores, you see a benefit of the devices also in the measure of fatigue. In a third test, a speech intelligibility test was conducted again in a study by our colleagues in Oldenburg, where people had 2 types of measures also. One was the objective measure, just the number of sentences or words identified correctly, and then also subjective measures were applied. And the subjective or the measures of effort were done in two ways. One was through subjective measures of listening effort and memory and noise annoyance, but in parallel also recordings of the EEG signal on the brain were conducted. And what we could see here is that in the noise condition, especially when we had the directional microphone systems on, to the very right, the second from the right, sorry, you can see that in the alpha band, the electrical signal indicating stress and effort, you can see less alpha band activity when you apply the noise reduction algorithms, the more sophisticated ones, which is the SZ stereo zoom in the signal to noise ratio condition with high signal to noise ratio and with low signal to noise ratio. So here we see also electrophysiologically that hearing instruments reduce effort in complex listening environments. So taken together, we can, here is one more study, which was a questionnaire-based study, and it's actually two studies. It has been repeated twice. The study questionnaires were sent out to, I think, 3,000–4,000 people in Europe, asking about hearing instruments use and non-hearing instrument use, and asking different questions around understanding speech in quiet and challenging conditions, perception of environmental sounds, but also how exhausted a person feels, how depressed a person feels, how forgetful a person feels, and sleep quality and things like that. And in these studies, subjective assessments, we could clearly see that people using hearing instruments typically feel less exhausted, feel less depressed, and feel less forgetful. So based on that, we can conclude that hearing instruments significantly improve quality of life. Another dimension where I think we can see, and that we also have to take into consideration in the future, that hearing instruments really contribute to quality of life, is simply the usage time of hearing instruments. When we look at the data of our data logging systems of more than 650,000 users now of the past 8 years, and 5 generations of hearing instruments as indicated by the different colors of the bars, then we can see that the average use time per day of the hearing instruments has increased by 1.5 hours over the past decade. So today it's around 9 to 12 hours, depending a little bit on the hearing loss. And what we also can see is that the devices that are not being used anymore, so the devices in the drawer in the very left group of columns, the ones with a usage time of less than 1 hour, we can see that that has systematically declined. So from my perspective, that is also an indication that hearing instruments in the past years have turned into useful devices and improve quality of life and enjoyment of life. So overall, I think we have quite some evidence from lab studies, from real life environment studies, from the usage time, that hearing instruments improve quality of life. But as I said, these are preliminary studies, and I think we have a lot of work to do to even show that in a with much stronger evidence than what we have today. But I think we have first indications that hearing instruments contribute significantly. Now, moving on to talk about hearing loss and comorbidities or multimorbidities. As I said, we are trying to take a broader perspective on hearing loss, on quality of life and other health considerations in elderly people. And we try to understand how hearing loss contributes to well-being. And I think this graph nicely summarizes what I have been talking about in the past few minutes. And now I want to focus a little bit on some specific aspects of hearing loss and comorbidities in the future, in the future slides. So hearing loss strongly correlates with multiple health conditions today. And you can divide that basically into two buckets. One is the mental health conditions, and the other one are the physical health conditions. We have recently also published a paper on that summarizing all these effects. Now, there have been quite a number of studies showing that hearing loss is correlated with a stronger social withdrawal, with higher risks of depressive symptoms. I just mentioned that, but also with an accelerated rate of cognitive decline and a higher risk of dementia. And this is a core feature or core comorbidity that has been studied extensively, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But on the other hand, we also can clearly see that hearing loss is related to a higher risk of falls and some other physical health conditions, such as much higher risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Now, we also have to discuss here that these are correlations, and the question is, what is the causality behind it, and is there any? What does this mean? And it's, for some, like especially the mental health conditions, the assumption today is that there is also a causal correlation, and that hearing loss is a contributing factor and potentially accelerates the mental health decline and the mental health conditions. Whereas for the physical conditions, especially cardiovascular and diabetes, it's more a common cause. So the same health conditions leading to cardiovascular problems and diabetes also cause hearing loss in the first place. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. Let's take a look at hearing loss and cognitive decline. This is something that has received really a lot of attention in the media and also in the publications. And there is a huge number of publications out there discussing the association of hearing loss and cognitive function and cognitive impairment. And I showed some of the publications here. The most influential paper for sure was a summary paper of the Lancet Commission on Dementia, where they clearly stated that dementia and Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline is a multifactorial process, and it cannot be reduced to a single factor. But they also concluded that hearing loss in midlife probably is one of the biggest and strongest accelerators, and especially a modifiable risk factor to dementia. So they strongly recommend and urge to do more research on this, to discuss the causality, but also to potentially start using hearing instruments to slow down cognitive decline as in a process. From my perspective, it's important to emphasize that there is a correlation between hearing loss and various very specific cognitive functions, as has been nicely summarized in this review paper in JAMA from last year or 2 years ago. There is a statistically significant but a weak correlation, again pointing to that hearing loss is a strong contributing factor, but in general the problem of cognitive decline is multifactorial and cannot be reduced to a single factor. That is important, and this just emphasizes one of the figures from the paper before. Here you can see that hearing loss impacts our ability to attend, our ability to on some memory tasks like immediate recall, but also processing tasks and reasoning tasks and working memory tasks. These are examples of cognitive functions that seem to be weakened in people with moderate to severe hearing losses. Now, the question that immediately arises is whether or not hearing instruments slow down cognitive decline. And that has been discussed pretty intensively. However, today we don't have any really randomized control longitudinal study providing strong evidence that this is the case. But we have some observational data, also from longitudinal data, that show quite some impact and that point to the idea and support the idea that hearing loss, hearing instruments might slow down cognitive decline. And one of the strongest, I find, this publication and plot by Piers Dawes and the group from Manchester, Maharani et al. Is the paper. They looked at a big database that they had from the US, where people were followed for like 10 years, where they had to go into a clinic. They participated in this trial, and they had various health tests, and one was a memory score test every year or every other year. And some of them in between turned hearing impaired and got a hearing instrument. And you see basically here the function of the memory score as a function of time, with years before using a hearing instrument and years after using a hearing instrument. And it is, or using a hearing instrument. And it is pretty striking how the memory performance of people starts to stabilize. And before they used the hearing instrument, memory decline was much higher, 4 times as high as once they started to use a hearing instrument. So from that, we could potentially conclude that hearing instruments might contribute to slowing down cognitive decline. But as I said, this study and others, like from Helena Mieva and others, point to and indicate that hearing instruments might contribute to slowing down cognitive decline, but they don't kind of provide strong evidence in the sense that they are not a randomized controlled trial. In many of the studies, accurate data on hearing loss has not been obtained, and the question is, how reliable is self-report? Oftentimes also the change in hearing loss has not been followed over time. And for example, also any information about the treatment of the device, the frequency of device use or benefit of the device has not been collected. And also the number of outcome measures, systematic outcome measures that have been used have not been have been very limited in their functionality. Some of them simply were screening tools and not really very thorough assessment tools. So the studies today still have limitations, but a number of authors now still recommend to start recommending hearing instruments also in the context of slowing down cognitive decline, simply because there is some weak evidence pointing to the fact that hearing instruments might help, and the risk of using a hearing instrument is pretty low, and the benefits in other dimensions are pretty high as well. Currently, there are at least 2 or 3 big randomized control trials underway that have been designed to answer this question, and we can expect answers within the next 2 years. One is conducted by Frank Lin and his team in the US, and the other one, the other big one, is conducted by Julia Sarant in in Melbourne. Both include several hundreds of patients, and we can be very curious and excited about the results that will be published next year in 2020, I guess. So finally, and very briefly, we can also see that there is quite a bit of correlation between hearing loss and systemic health conditions. And the ones I want to mention here in particular is the correlation between hearing loss and an increased risk of falls, and potentially the hearing loss and the risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Now, for both the latter two, cardiovascular disease and diabetes, hearing instruments for sure cannot help with cardiovascular disease or diabetes, but there are two comments to make. And one is, when a person has a hearing loss, the patient physician communication is pretty difficult. And hearing loss can contribute to that, in that hearing impaired people don't understand the content. They have misunderstandings or even communication breakdown, which can lead to misuse of medication, to not adherence to medication, and impact the cardiovascular disease and diabetes in that shape and form. That's one aspect. A second aspect is that today's hearing instruments have acoustic sensors, but what we see emerging very strongly is the integration of other sensor technologies in the hearing instrument. So by integrating PPG sensors to assess heart rate variability, we can assess cardiovascular disease and issue warnings. By integrating accelerometers, we can see how active a person is, which also correlates with their risk and the risk mitigation of cardiovascular problems and diabetes. So with respect to these two conditions, adding sensor technologies to the hearing instruments might offer completely new ways of helping people with these health conditions in the future. The same holds for the third correlation and comorbidity between hearing loss and the increased risk of falls. There is quite a number of papers now that have clearly shown that hearing impaired people are at a much higher risk of falling. And there is even some weak evidence that hearing instruments might help with improving posture and gait. But I think the evidence here is super weak. And again, here, this would be a field and a clear application where we could add accelerometers and other sensors to learn the movement patterns of a person and to provide them with information and warnings when they are at risk of falls or become unstable. So again, moving forward, for these comorbidities, technology might offer completely new ways of servicing and helping people with respect to this health conditions. So let me briefly summarize. I wanted to talk about and discuss how I find hearing to be a very important sense for our social well-being, beyond our pure ability to understand speech and hear sounds in our environment. It's very important for socialization and offers a lot of subconscious information to our well-being. Also, I think hearing loss has a very strong impact on our quality of life, extending far beyond the pure reduced and limited ability to understand speech. And I discussed problems such as emotion perception, higher signs of depression, social isolation, loneliness, and aspects like that. I also discussed that hearing instruments today improve quality of life, they reduce listening effort, they help to avoid fatigue, and we have shown evidence from multiple studies that can show how hearing instruments contribute here. Moving forward, the question is whether hearing instruments also can turn into vital sign and health monitoring devices. And one question is, what are the implications of integrating multiple sensors for multiple health conditions in hearing instruments for our healthcare service delivery model in general? That's a question that is open. So specifically, I think today we have to put hearing and audiological rehabilitation in a different context. We have to present it and talk about it as a sound foundation for well-being, and we have to discuss how hearing instruments can turn into healthy living companions. The major points I would discuss in the first place relate to psychosocial health considerations and to discuss and present to hearing impaired people how hearing loss contributes to psychosocial functioning and how hearing instruments can help. A second very specific topic I think we should address is the correlation between hearing loss and cognitive decline as a topic, and also the increased risk of falls in hearing impaired people and what we can do about that. One topic I haven't discussed at all is the pediatric dimension. I'm mainly focused in this talk on the comorbidities between hearing loss and other health conditions in elderly people. We also see quite some comorbidities also in the pediatric population. One that I just wanted to briefly mention is that, for example, for children with autism disorders, we see a pretty strong correlation also with their ability to understand speech in complex environments. And also here, hearing devices or communication devices can help. I'm just mentioning this to point out that this notion of putting hearing healthcare in the context of healthy living and quality of life extends beyond the elderly population. Also, I focused on that in this presentation. With that, I'm at the end, and I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And I'm sorry if I missed out on any questions. I don't know whether I should have seen any or not. So thank you very much.
Stefan, thank you. That was fascinating. And just a quick reminder to everyone on the webinar, if you do have questions, please do submit those through the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will take those as they come in. While we're waiting on that, Stefan, I've got a follow-up question on a point you just made in your summary around the impact on overall healthcare delivery as certainly an open question in terms of applying hearing instruments and the advancements in these hearing instruments in broader elements of the healthcare delivery. How do you see that playing out? It's certainly an open question, but what are you most excited about in terms of the new developments coming along?
Well, I see quite a huge potential in integrating these sensors if we don't take the perspective of sensors, but the perspective of healthy living. And from my perspective, products that integrate new technologies and offer new services could offer a lot of new opportunities. I think the challenge will be for us to come to a more integrated healthcare model. Today, all the healthcare disciplines work pretty much in isolation. And I think we have to foster what I would call, and this term comes from Louis Sixon in Brisbane, interprofessional healthcare, where people collaborate, or healthcare professionals collaborate much more and much stronger with each other on the various topics. That is where I would see a need in the future, that we manage to connect the hearing healthcare professionals with other healthcare professionals, like much more the ENTs, the neurologists, the cardiologists, so that they understand what they are doing and how things interact and correlate with each other.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, that I think this next question has direct relevance there, which is first of all, thanks and nicely done presentation. Do you anticipate more studies to determine causality versus correlation of the comorbidities?
Yes, there is a pretty rich body of literature out there on a couple of topics such as diabetes or hypertension and cardiovascular problems. There is quite a rich body of literature out there, which is all referenced in the publication that we did, which I'm happy to provide the link to. And also for the cognitive decline and hearing loss, there is quite a bit of evidence in the meantime to discuss and explain the correlation and causation. I just didn't have the time to go through it here.
Yeah.
But
well, I'm sorry, Stefan. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
There is pretty sound explanations now how these mechanisms work.
Yeah. Well, and per the answer to the previous question, I would think the more research studies that come out, not just around the correlation, but also the causation, will help break down some of those silos in terms of the healthcare delivery elements.
Absolutely, I hope so too.
Yeah. Next question is, does hearing loss have an impact on sleep?
I'm not aware of a direct impact. That is a really good question. I'm not aware of any study clearly showing that correlation, but I am aware that people using hearing instruments report better sleep quality. So it may have to do more with being less stressed and less anxious and things like that, less depressed. But I haven't seen that carefully studied, or at least I'm not aware of the publications.
Got it. Next question is, what is your opinion on the OTC hearing instrument? OTC being over the counter, I believe.
Yeah, we have done. We have looked into this topic also quite intensively, and we have to be very aware that OTC is not really new. There have been several attempts to do that, and there are several solutions already available today with all the PSAPs and hearing instruments in a self-service approach. I think potentially, if done in the right way, OTC could contribute to broaden the adoption and the acceptance of hearing instruments. I would always recommend that the devices have to be controlled in such a way that the quality of the devices is really good. Otherwise, they potentially could do some harm. And I think it should always be emphasized, or at least encouraged, that despite doing it all by themselves or over the counter, in case of trouble, contact a healthcare professional to help you further. We have seen it in studies that involving a healthcare professional potentially even improves adoption in an OTC model. So I think there is, it should not be either or, OTC or audiology. There could also be a blended model, and that's what I think about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, we are at the top of the hour here, and Stefan, I want to thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to share all of this information with us. It was a great presentation, and certainly a lot of interest from the audience. So we very much appreciate that.
Okay, thank you
And
very much.
yeah, thank you. And I want to thank everyone who joined us here for the webinar today. And as a reminder, I will send around links to the slides and to the recording of the webinar. And please do share those with any of your colleagues who might be interested. And with that, we will go ahead and sign off, and hoping everyone has a great rest of the day.
Okay, thank
All right.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.